Let's start by looking at 3 novel ideas that got rejected. This is from an internal memo written by Western Union in 1876. It said, "This telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value." Next, a Yale University professor critiquing Fred Smith's paper proposing an overnight delivery service. As you probably know, Smith later founded FedEx. The feedback said this: "The concept is interesting and well-formed, but in order to earn a grade of C or better, the idea must be feasible." And finally, our third example, guitar groups are on the way out. This was from Decca Recording Company rejecting the Beatles in 1962. In our last lecture, we looked at divergent thinking, which is generating novelty. In convergent thinking, which we use to balance off divergent thinking, we're applying evaluation. We're examining and exploring novelty. Convergent thinking is about selective retention, finding the novelty that's going to be most adaptable. When we diverge, we are generating lots of novelty. Effective convergence is about exploring and extracting value from novelty. The quotes that I just shared with you reflect pure outright rejection of novelty. You may recall the car analogy in that divergent thinking is like using the accelerator. We've enhanced and worked on the mindset for improving divergent thinking. We've, in a way, enhanced the horsepower of your mental engine, your creative thinking skill related to divergent thinking. Now we shift to convergent thinking. Convergent thinking is the braking system. And in this lecture, we work on improving the braking system. If you have a more powerful engine, you need an equally powerful braking system. So in this lecture, we look at the mindset for convergence, the attitudes that enhance convergent thinking. In divergent thinking, I suggested that deferring judgment was the key principle, which is learning to suspend evaluation, putting it off temporarily. When we converge, we bring judgment back in. We get real. We introduce judgment, but in a productive way. When faced with an original idea, generally, the way we respond, the most immediate response is to judge it in terms of what's wrong with it. Have you heard the expressions, "That won't work," "It's impossible," "We can't afford that," or "We've tried that before already"? This kind of critical thinking kills novelty. So the key principle, like deferring judgment for divergence, the key principle for convergent thinking is to use affirmative judgment. Here's what research tells us about criticism. When given too early, negative feedback hinders scientific creativity. Premature criticism resulted in creative people withdrawing their ideas, especially when ideas are in the formative stage. And neuroscience shows us that we're more creative when we're in a good mood. We're more open to new connections. Let me share with you a real story about lack of affirmative judgment. Aviation celebrated its 100th anniversary in terms of controlled powered flight a short while ago. However, early on, there were staunch opponents to the use of planes in the military. And this came primarily from military leaders in the established branches, the Navy and Army. They believed airplanes had no real advantage. They lacked that mindset to affirmatively explore novelty. There was one visionary by the name of Billy Mitchell. He was the first American to fly over enemy positions during World War I, and he saw many benefits. When he flew over the trenches, he realized that there was a stalemate that cost many lives, and he believed that adding a third dimension to warfare would in fact save lives. After World War I, he returned to the U.S. with the rank of general. He spoke out about airplanes and their role in future warfare and their importance. but he was viewed as a heretic. He was a threat to the establishment. In fact, he was ordered to tone it down. Instead, he got louder. It came to a head in July of 1921. He was challenged to a test. Here was the challenge: to attack a captured German battleship, a massive battleship believed to be unsinkable. 12/19, the day of the test, a fleet of small Martin bombers appeared on the horizon, tiny in comparison to this behemoth of a battleship. 20 minutes later, the battleship disappeared. It had been successfully sunk. General John Pershing, even after this test, who was the general of the armies at that time, still wrote a report suggesting that battleships would remain the backbone of the Navy. Despite intense criticism, Billy Mitchell continued to speak out. In response, the military sent Mitchell on an extended inspection tour of Hawaii, the Philippines, China, India, and Japan. The exile did not dampen his enthusiasm. In fact, it had the opposite effect. It made him more convinced that in the future that they would need to control the skies in order to win the war. In the mid-1920s, he predicted war with Japan and hypothesized a surprise attack from the air. This was the last straw. Mitchell was court-martialed for insubordination. He was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years without pay. This was unacceptable to him. He resigned, and he continued to speak out. On February 19th of 1936, at age 57, Billy Mitchell passed away. Some suggest that he passed away prematurely because of the stress that he endured. Less than 6 years later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor from the air. At the outset of the war, President Roosevelt met with his advisors to look at how they might ramp up for war. They recommended to build up the traditional military. But Roosevelt remembered Mitchell and his vision, and he diverted money to military aircraft. You see, before World War II, in a 2-year period, only 800 planes had been built in the U.S. And Roosevelt now demanded that 2,000 planes be built each year. This story illustrates the rejection of a novel idea, a lack of affirmative judgment. We need to take a balanced approach to evaluation. When we're done diverging, it's not time to come in and slaughter and rip out all the novel ideas. Rather, we need to take an affirmative, open-minded approach, first looking for the positives, and then looking for the shortcomings. We resist the all too often tendency to prematurely criticize an original idea. Shortcomings are viewed as ways to improve. Remember the tool yes and how that focuses on improving the idea. I had a funny reaction several years ago in a training program when I had completed training a group in divergent thinking and brainstorming. And after we had gone through some brainstorming exercises, one of the participants in the group immediately said, "You know, we do brainstorming all the time in our organization. We have lots of brainstorming meetings and they never work." And so I inquired. I said to this person, "Well, in brainstorming, our goal is to generate lots of ideas. When you do brainstorming in your organization, do you get lots of ideas?" And the person said, "Oh, yeah, I get lots of ideas." Okay, well, when you brainstorm, the goal is to come up with original ideas. We're engaging in divergent thinking, and our goal is to come up with some novel perspectives and options. Do you have that kind of novelty? And this person said, yeah, we get novel options. I'm perplexed, I'm confused now. You say brainstorming doesn't work. It sounds to me like you are effectively engaging in divergent thinking. What do you mean it doesn't work? And this is when the person told me that When they brainstorm, sure, they come up with lots of ideas and they're novel, but when they go to select the ideas and options they're going to carry forward, they only select the safe ideas. You see, brainstorming worked. They generated many options and they had novel options, but when they converged, their braking system, if you will, couldn't keep up with their engine, the horsepower that they were using for divergent thinking. So the second principle of convergent thinking, the second attitude that helps us to converge effectively in a creative process, is to keep novelty alive, not to ignore original concepts and immediately move to the safe and not terribly risky solutions. Instead, it's staying open. After all, in divergent thinking, we've left that zone of familiarity. We went into the zone of new discovery. What happens when you engage in divergent thinking, but you never select the novel options in convergent thinking, is that you teach people that there's no point in dreaming, that there's no point engaging in divergent thinking, no point in pursuing new thoughts. And this is risky because without variation, without novelty, there can be no evolution. There can be no growth. Keeping novelty alive also refers to staying open to unexpected experiences, exploring the value of that unexpected experience. Microwave ovens, they're everywhere. But the discovery of the microwave oven was an accident. It was an unexpected incident that was not ignored. The magnetron was invented during World War II in England. A magnetron tube, which emits microwaves, is installed in the radar system, and this is useful, or was useful, in spotting German warplanes. A few years later, while working with magnetron tubes, a scientist named Percy LeBaron Spencer found a melted chocolate bar in his pocket. He didn't ignore that. This was a novel surprise. He got curious, and he deduced that the microwaves were the cause of this. Further investigation showed that microwaves cooked faster than conventional ovens. Let me give you another example. Pfizer, multinational pharmaceutical company, didn't start out searching for a drug to address penile dysfunction, but thanks to a sharp-eyed clinician, that is what they found. Originally known as compound UK 92480, which was originally created as an antihypertensive drug and later for angina, they discovered that during clinical trials there was an interesting side effect, penile erection. Now, despite prevailing belief that penile dysfunction was psychological, the team explored this novel outcome. They investigated it, and the net result led to Viagra. In summary, to keep novelty alive refers to doing at least two things: eliminating premature judgment, not ignoring novel ideas. It also refers to staying curious about unexpected experiences and outcomes, as we heard in our two stories about the microwave and Viagra. Let's look at the next principle for convergent thinking, the next attitude. Check your objectives. During divergent thinking, we're escaping from reality. We're ignoring the constraints of reality. When we begin to converge, however, we have to bring our ideas and our options back into reality. We need to be conscious of reality. Remember, creativity is the production of original ideas that are made useful or have value. To ensure ideas are useful, we need to evaluate potential solutions against success criteria. What will make it work in reality? So this third principle we call check your objectives. While intuition can bring insight, ultimately novel ideas must work in reality in order to stick, they must meet the needs of that reality. Bob Hope did this. We discussed Bob Hope earlier in terms of how he went through a process of evaluating jokes that were generated by his team of writers, the Double Cross and Circle Club. He had specific objectives. Well, he had a specific objective in mind. Jokes had to make him laugh. And not just once, they had to make him laugh 3 times. Hope was clear. We can be explicit just like Bob Hope. Sometimes our objectives to screen these promising options are subjective, like does it make me laugh? Sometimes our objectives can be more concrete, like money, cost, time, space, resources. Later, we'll learn some specific tools that will help us to apply these as criteria, these objectives. Let's move on to the 4th principle in convergent thinking. Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Accordingly, a genius is often merely a talented person who's done all of his or her homework. Divergent thinking is playful. It's fun. There's lots of energy. Convergent thinking has a different feel to it. It does require close scrutiny and persistence. Creative ideas rarely come complete and well-formed. We need to evaluate and use critical thinking to test and refine them. Creativity is hard work. Having an idea sometimes is easy. The hard work is making an interesting, novel idea a great solution. So this 4th principle we formally call stay focused. This helps us to ensure that the best alternatives are selected and developed. At the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned the Beatles and how they were rejected in 1962 by Decca Records. I believe the Beatles are a shining example of this principle, staying focused. Here's a specific example from the Beatles. One of their all-time greatest hits, Yesterday, was originally titled Scrambled Eggs. Paul McCartney woke up one morning with a tune in his head, and he worked on it for months. At first, he only had the melody. As he said, I didn't have any words at first, so I blocked it out with scrambled eggs, oh my baby, how I love your legs, diddle diddle, I believe in scrambled eggs. McCartney spent weeks playing with the song without lyrics. In fact, some of the other Beatles were beginning to get annoyed and told him he needed to move on. When the words finally came, he spent about 2 weeks finalizing the song. Stay focused, I believe, clearly is a characteristic of the Beatles, where they refined, and it's also evident in their recording process. Let's look at 3 songs: Blackbird, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and Something. Blackbird. Paul McCartney recorded 32 takes in one day before selecting the eventual version that would appear in the White Album. In terms of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the Beatles spent 8 hours rehearsing and reworking that song while the crew sat around waiting for them to finish it. And when they finally recorded it, it took only 7 takes. Something, which was originally recorded on April 16, 1969, there were 3 takes of the basic track. On May 2nd, they remade the song, recording 36 takes, and they decided the 36 was the best. In August, they added an orchestra. Later, they cut 2 minutes of instrumental and released the final form in September 26th. The Beatles reflect, I think, that 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. But I think the prize for staying focused goes to poet William Wordsworth. You see, he spent 40 years revising and rewriting the prelude. The lines about nature in this poem were beautiful and eloquent, so much so that they must have been natural for him to pen, but No, that really came through brute force. In fact, one critic observed that this naturalism was not achieved by simple spontaneity. It required a great deal of deliberate, knowing, self-criticism, and revision. Here's the lesson. There's a misconception about creativity that's popular and often embraced by many individuals, that all we need is that aha moment. We need that bolt of lightning to hit us, and we're creative. The reality is that aha moment, in order for creativity to really happen, must be followed by hard work. So the principles for effective convergence, those principles that create the mindset for effective convergence within a creative process, are to apply affirmative judgment, to keep novelty alive, to check your objectives, to make sure that your options meet the needs of reality, and stay focused. Let's look at three deliberate tools that move our convergent process from a more intuitive process to a more deliberate, systematic process. The first tool we call hits. It's much like what Bob Hope did when he was converging on jokes. We review our divergent list, identifying the most promising options. And we mark those options that are most appealing to us, the ones that we think will be successful, the ones that hold the greatest value. This tool can be used as a group, so it can be done individually, as Bob Hope probably worked. Hits can also be used as a tool to help teams to converge. Now, naturally, when you're using it as a team, it's more complicated and it will take more time. So a recommendation that I have is, if you use hits to evaluate a list of divergent ideas, to mark the ones that seem most promising, you might want to limit the number of hits that you give members of the team. The general rule of thumb we use is the 10% rule. So if you've generated 100 options, you take 10% and give each individual 10 votes, 10 hits. Now, when you do this, be careful of groupthink. We want to avoid people selecting options because someone else has selected that option. So you might first want to allow people to review the options, the list of ideas that were generated through divergent thinking, and to make their choices independently and then later show them publicly. Hits can be expanded to a second tool, clustering. So we begin by identifying our hits, and sometimes when we identify our hits, we notice that there are some themes that emerge, that there are options that naturally relate to one another, and we can categorize them, we can put them into clusters. To ensure that these clusters really hang together, we suggest that you put labels on the cluster. You identify what the theme is, and you give some descriptive theme to that cluster. When you use this tool and you cluster, be sure that the clusters remain independent. They shouldn't overlap. Also, be sure that all of the items in that cluster really belong to that cluster. That's the importance of having the theme. We don't want to force all of our options or all of our ideas into clusters. And if there's one that's unique, we lose the uniqueness if we force it into a group. It's okay to leave unique items alone. The third tool is called blue sky voting. Here we use codes to help us to understand our reaction to our hits. We use coding labels or electronic bullets. We use two colors, green and blue. When we go through and we identify our hits, we use these two colors to represent two different reactions to these options that we're evaluating. Some hits, we use green dots or green bullets. Green meaning we're green lighting that idea or that option. It's fairly straightforward. We're excited about it. It's easy to implement. We can just do it. Then we reserve in the spirit of staying open to novelty, we reserve some of our hits for those blue sky ideas, and we use blue dots or blue bullets. These are options that are out there, that are highly novel. We're excited about these options, but gosh, we're not sure how to implement them. But if we could, wow, they would be dynamite. So we split our hits between these two sets. Now, when we do this, let's go back to the example of doing this in a group. If we're giving 10 hits to group members, what we might want to do is to give more dots to the green lighted ideas, let's say 7, and 3 for the blue sky ideas. In fact, you can do the same thing yourself. And in this way, you're intentionally staying open to those novel options. In fact, this blue sky voting is my preferred way of going through convergence. I use this very often when I'm working with groups because it does help to keep novelty alive, and it helps to sort options into those that are easier to pursue versus those that will require more thought. And it's also interesting in a group application because you begin to see different perceptions. And is there consensus and excitement building around those blue sky options? So there are some further things to be thinking about in terms of divergent and convergent thinking. And a common question that I'm asked when I work with groups is, how do you split your time between divergent and convergent thinking? Well, there's no right answer to this. But I can tell you it's a common mistake to spend too much time on divergent thinking. After all, it's fun and people enjoy it and they get lost in the divergent thinking. And suddenly they realize, oh gosh, we need to come to a decision, and they will often make a quick convergent decision. As a very loose general rule, I recommend that you spend about the same amount of time on convergent thinking as you do on divergent thinking. And because convergent thinking is a bit more complicated with groups where you have to discuss and move towards consensus, we might even want to dedicate slightly more time, perhaps 60% to convergent thinking and 40% to divergent thinking. So let's apply what we've learned. I want to encourage you to practice these principles of convergent thinking individually. Find a challenge, either at work or perhaps a personal challenge. Start with some divergent thinking. And then once you're satisfied that you've generated enough options, then shift to convergent thinking. Use one of the tools that you learned in this lecture. Try out doing hits or clustering, where you do hits and then you group the options. Try out blue sky voting. Try this out with groups as well. First with groups that are safe, maybe families and friends and coworkers that you get along well with, who you can experiment with. Identify a challenge. If you're working with the family, perhaps what to do this weekend or where to go on vacation. With work, maybe goals for next year. And again, begin by divergent thinking and then apply convergent thinking. See what the difference is like when you apply these tools of hits, clustering, and blue sky voting with groups. It's important to master this skill of convergent thinking and the tools, because these tools will be used throughout the creative process, whether you're clarifying or you're generating ideas or you're thinking about ways to carry the idea forward. We'll be using these tools. We used divergent and convergent thinking recently with our boys. We generate ideas for what to do over the weekend. So we began by telling them the guidelines for divergent thinking. We all generated ideas for what we might do for the weekend. And then we taught them blue sky voting for convergence. We gave them green dots for just do it's, and we gave them blue dots for their wishes. And I have to be honest, I was surprised by their decision. They wanted to spend the night in a hotel in Buffalo, where we live. That was the green light idea. But their blue sky idea, I wouldn't have predicted. These 3 boys wanted to go on a shopping spree. And then the next day, they wanted to visit boutiques and artisan shops on a well-known street in Buffalo, Elmwood Avenue. Follow the guidelines for convergent thinking. Try these tools with your family and friends, and you might just be surprised by the results like I was.